So strategies and tactics. The short-term objective gives you the behavior to be learned, right? So if you think about antecedent, behavior, consequence, the short-term objective identifies the behavior that we want the student to learn. The tactics are going to identify the antecedent conditions and strategies and the consequent strategies, those bookends around behavior, because learning is influenced by what the teacher does. Think of that visual yesterday with the green, yellow, green columns, antecedent, behavior, consequence. Teacher behavior influences the student learning behavior in the middle. So in order to provide instruction, we need to complete the learn unit, because we've just, with the short-term objective, talked about the student's response. So looking at the antecedent side of things, you'd be thinking about motivation, right? What motivates the student to engage in the desired response, or might be motivating them to not engage in it and be escape motivated. What are the particular antecedents that you'll be delivering? What are the prompts that are used? I've described prompts already as the help that is provided. Once I ask the student to do something and I know they can't do it, which is why it's their short-term objective, then I will give them some help to facilitate the correct response so that they can be successful, they can engage in the desired learning outcome, so that we then can close the learning loop, that learn unit or discrete trial, with an effective consequence, which is going to be capturing it with reinforcement. And then, as I've said countless times thus far, the greatest predictor of learning is response opportunities. It's repetition, doing it a lot. So make sure that you have lots of opportunities to repeat the learn unit as many times as possible, or repeat that worksheet as many times as possible until the behavior comes under the control of the material and is learned. All right, so that list is, it seems simple, right? Motivation, antecedents, prompting, what you do before, and consequences, what you do after. The consequences are really going to be effective reinforcers. A number of years ago, my undergraduate ABA students at Capilano University made me a t-shirt, and on the front of it, it says, if you don't have reinforcement, and on the back of it, there's a picture of all my students pointing to the door, and it says, go home. You need reinforcement by definition to capture behavior and strengthen it so that you can get learning. A behavior that is not reinforced, that is not consequated in that meaningful way, will tend not to continue occurring, will not come to strength, will not be incorporated into the student's repertoire. So a big issue in school settings is making sure that you have effective reinforcing consequences. And you have to be creative in that. There are some students where there's very little that motivates them, and that's a particularly challenging challenge. Because if I don't have reinforcement, I might as well go home. Can't do that, so we need to come up with effective reinforcement. And that's where you might be looking at so-called primary reinforcers, things that you don't have to learn to like, that could include food. And that becomes a bit of a values issue for a lot of folks in school to say, well, we don't use food to motivate kids in school. And I would totally agree and say, I don't want to be using food to motivate kids in school either. We'd rather be using age-appropriate, socially motivating reinforcers. And if we have those things and they're effective, that's what we will use, because that is enabling the student to move into the best possible future for themselves, where those are the natural consequences. However, if a student is not responsive to those consequences, those aren't reinforcers, then you gotta use what you have. And in some cases, food is all you have. And people need to be flexible to accept, all right, it's not desirable. We would prefer not to be using food, but we recognize we do need effective reinforcers. And so at least in the short term, we're gonna be willing to use food to facilitate learning with the long-term goal that we can fade food out, right? So I go into some, and the reason I mention that is I go into some settings and they say, we absolutely forbid food. That's not normal in this setting. And I completely appreciate that. I wouldn't promote using food unless you absolutely had to be using food, but beggars can't be choosers. If that's what works, that's what you got. Now, some of you I know, some of you on the education side of the audience, or even some of you parents, you're thinking, but that doesn't even motivate my child. I talk to some school teams where their biggest challenge is coming up with what motivates the child. Because if you can't motivate the child, right, to work towards something and be able to deliver an effective consequence, it's hard to arrange any instructional circumstances. So often the conversation deserves to start around, do we have effective reinforcers? Right? And that's one of those bits of information that parents could be sharing with the school in advance. Here's this wide range of things. The more that we have to work with as reinforcers, the better position we are in. If we have limited reinforcers, this just requires a whole lot more care and consideration and constant thought and testing and trying new things out. This is where If you have access to your friendly neighborhood behavior analyst, they have training in doing stimulus preference assessments, and there's a whole research methodology in assessing preference, because we recognize we have to have some preferred things that we can possibly deliver as effective reinforcers. So I just wanted to take that moment to stress you have to have reinforcement. And some of you are going, well, why do you keep going on about this, Richard? The students I work with, it's not an issue. Like, they are responsive to praise and high fives and typical classroom consequences like stickers on a sticker chart, or for your desk group, or teacher praise, or grades themselves. That's fantastic. Speaking of grades, I know that grades are under attack in the education system. They're being phased out, increasingly being phased out. But one of the things that I recognize when students come into university, for example, one of the biggest motivators for success in university is getting a good grade. And then I kind of reverse engineer that back to high school, and I think about the students that I work with and support, and many of them haven't been exposed to the idea of getting a grade. They've never had grades. And we've taken that analysis even further back into elementary school, where for learners of a particular profile, where grades do matter, because they won't matter to everybody, we ought to be thinking about that earlier and exposing them to your relative efforts that you put into your learning yields these differential outcomes, right? This effort got you a C, and this effort got you a B, and here's an A. If this is going to facilitate the student's later success, because they're likely to go into environments where those types of consequences are the norm and are typical, right? So just think about that. I've run into a number of circumstances myself where we realize too late we've missed the boat on this. We should have been introducing the student to the contingencies of grades earlier on, because now we're at a point, let's say in middle school or high school, where that should really start to matter, but it's a foreign idea to my student. And when we reflect on why is it a foreign idea, because we haven't introduced it. It's not the student's fault, it's our fault, right? So I'll step off the soapbox there. If you don't have reinforcement, go home. You have to have reinforcement, and that's tied into the motivation. So moving on, strategies and tactics. Here's a real example. So the short-term objective is use the question forms when, why, how, and which. And based on our last hour together, you're immediately looking at that STO and going, that is not a smart STO. That doesn't tell me the context in which you're asking these WH questions, or the criteria, or the deadline. That's true. So it's already a faulty STO, but let's look at the strategies. So strategy 1 for teaching asking using these WH is direct instruction. And then the question becomes, what is direct instruction? Does direct instruction mean one-on-one instruction? Does it mean capital D, capital I, a manualized program of instruction that is called direct instruction? There are different definitions of direct instruction. If it's one-on-one, that should be spelled out. Is this the teacher delivering this? Is this the education assistant delivering this? The use of visual supports? Which visual supports? And this goes back to the faultiness of this particular STO as it's worded in front of you. Because I don't know the context in which the student is supposed to engage in asking these WH questions, I don't know what visual supports means in this context. Used contrived situations? Okay, I can infer into that in order to be motivated to ask these questions, you have to create circumstances that invite asking these questions. So that would be my interpretation of contrived situations. But is that what this means? And what does that look like? Does this need to be more specific? Model and demonstrate for him. It's limited logic here. Yeah, yes, modeling and demonstrating. We benefit from models. But arguably, this student, let's say they're 6 or 7 years old, they've been around on the planet for 6 or 7 years. They've probably seen thousands of models of people asking WH, and clearly that has been insufficient. If it was that easy, they would have learned it by now. So just modeling doesn't necessarily yield behavior change, unless following a model, then you prompt a response, right? So this idea that I model and then you'll magically copy a model is faulty. We need to see behavior. We need to see the verb, the action, the doing. So I can model for you, but I wouldn't leave it at modeling. I would want to prompt to make sure you copy the model. And then I love the last one here. It makes me chuckle. Have peers use grammatically correct sentences. This implies to me that this student is in a classroom where nobody uses grammatically correct sentences, right? It just becomes silly, right? Like the other kids aren't using grammatically correct sentences. then they probably all need IEPs as well, where their objective is to learn grammatically correct sentences. So this is really a weak list of strategies. It's an unclear list of strategies. It's a vague list of strategies. And we like specificity not just for the short-term objective, but also for the tactics. How are you going to achieve this? So let's improve this. The short-term objective is that Freddy will learn to ask peers what questions. So now we've narrowed it down from WH to just one WH, what questions, when enticed, with 100% accuracy 3 times per day. All that's missing in this short-term objective to make it even better is a deadline by when they would achieve this. And the enticement is really, you can envision a circumstance where friends have like closed bags that you can't see inside of, like a paper bag, and they might shake it and like look in it, and the student can't see, but they look and go, oh wow, cool. And that's meant to be a hook to capture the student's attention. And if they're interested in what's in that bag, now you've contrived the opportunity to prompt the student to say, what is it, right? What's in the bag? Or whatever the what question is. And then the reinforcer is the peer reveals what's in the bag, and they're reinforced for asking what by seeing the answer to their what question. Right? The information should be the reinforcer. So the strategies then are the SCA will arrange instructional times each day. And again, specificity, 3 times per day in this case. You want to entice the student to ask what 3 times per day. Contrive motivation by providing peer with a goodie bag. And you have to be careful about this, right? If I had one paper bag and we used it all the time, then the student is learning a limited lesson. Okay, for some reason now at school, when people bring out this bag, I'm supposed to say what, and they show me cool things, right? This is a starting point. You need to make sure that you're generalizing out from this to make it a more functional repertoire. Once the enticement is there, the adult provides the prompts, right? You can say, what's in the bag? That's a full verbal prompt, right? I've said the whole thing. That's a model prompt. And the student echoes after me, and then the peer does the reveal, which is the reinforcer. That's delivering the information that is asked for. And then the next time we set that up, I wouldn't want to have to continue to say what's in the bag. You'd want to be able to fade out your prompt so that you're using less of a vocal prompt, or you're using a visual prompt or a textual prompt, right? There's a whole research base and, dare I say, art to prompting. But the big deal with prompts is they actually are what control the student's success. And you need to get rid of prompts by definition so that the student's success is controlled ultimately at the end of instruction by the naturally occurring antecedent condition, right? The context or the worksheet or the teacher's question, whatever the natural cue would be, okay? So moving on, another example. Here's a bad STO with some poor strategies. We'll read faster. The strategies are speech-language pathology, 45 minutes per week. As I've said countless times now, the greatest predictor of learning is the number of response opportunities. If you're limiting it to 45 minutes once per week, that's going to be insufficient. Also, if the goal is around reading faster, well, we can access the science of literacy. And the National Reading Panel will tell you pretty clearly that any student who is not at grade level in their oral reading fluency is at risk for failure, and the default level or intensity of intervention should be for any student with or without disabilities, a minimum of 20 minutes per day of one-to-one individualized instruction in order to remediate their literacy challenge or stretch, if you will. So 45 minutes once per week isn't an adequate dosage of intervention. You need a higher dosage of intervention. You need more opportunities for responding, more learning trials. So you need to make this daily. And you can continue with the speech pathologist if that was part of the plan, 45 minutes once per week, but what's happening on the other 4 days per week? Modeling, listen to peers. Arguably the student has listened to peers before and that hasn't worked. Provide interesting books. Absolutely, that goes to one of those antecedent conditions around motivation. You are probably more interested in reading something that's interesting to you. So that's a good tactic, but that's providing the context that's interesting. Use cue cards. That doesn't tell me how or what or why. What are these cue cards, right? If I'm the education assistant and I'm given this as the document, and this is my roadmap, and I'm largely responsible for implementing this, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this cue card thing. It lacks specificity. And then the final strategy here is work on critical thinking. Well, think about Bloom's taxonomy. Critical thinking is at the sophisticated upper end of Bloom's taxonomy of skills. if we're working on oral reading fluency, that has nothing to do with critical thinking, right? Oral reading fluency, the ability to read quickly, is predictive of how you will comprehend what you read. If you don't read accurately or quickly, it will necessarily impact and degrade your comprehension. But this idea of critical thinking isn't a tactic to teach oral reading fluency, to read faster. This is a goal unto itself, right? So whenever you see something like this, you have to cross that out and recognize that's not a tactic, that's a goal. So this example here is just a complete hot mess, right? We need to fix this. The short-term objective is that Freddy will achieve 40 words per minute with oral reading fluency, with grade 1 materials, with no more than 4 errors per minute, 5 times per week. So what do we see here? That he'll achieve 40 words per minute. That's both the criterion and what he will do, right, in terms of accurately reading quickly. The context is grade 1 materials, and part of the criterion is no more than 4 errors per minute. Where does 4 errors per minute come from? That also comes from the science of literacy instruction, which is probably the area of educational research that the field of education knows the most about, which is how to teach literacy. And the reading science tells us that if you make more than 4 errors per minute in your oral reading fluency, that will start to have a negative impact on how you understand what you're reading, because you're making too many mistakes. If you're making mistakes, you're not reading correctly, you can't understand it correctly. So that's kind of the upper threshold of the errors that are acceptable, and that's why that's in there. And then you've got 5 times per week. This is more congruent with the National Reading Panel recommendations that you need to be working on this daily. So that's a better goal. Now, the strategies are very specific to achieving that goal. So use nonfiction books from grade 1 series, and you can include the student's preferences for sure and choice in this. Warm up each reading with folding in and model read. And so that does need a bit more explanation, but that's actually what you're going to do with the cue cards. What you will do is have the student read the book, and every time they make a mistake, you'll make a note of the error word, and then you'll take those words and you'll put them onto cue cards. And then before they read the story, you're going to review the cue cards in isolation. You're going to take them out of the whole and work on them just as a part until the student is doing well and accurately, quick and accurate with the cue cards. And then you're going to fold them back into reading. Now that you've looked at these words on the cue cards, now these same words are in the book that I'm going to provide to you. So sight words are always intimately tied to words you will read in connected text, which actually speaks against practices like simply memorizing the Dolch word 50 most common words or the 100 most common words. Those are decontextualized words, and for students who are struggling, it makes way more sense to use sight word targets that are tied to the books they're reading, not just arbitrary lists of words. Then we're going to read 3 times, 1 minute each, and we're going to graph that as we go with each minute. So we're taking data for every 1-minute trial that we do within this 20-minute block of instruction. And we're going to reinforce with a token system, so there's your consequence. And we're also going to reinforce by letting the student look at their data, because we feel at this point the student would be responsive to their data. So now we have a much better, smarter, measurable, accountable short-term objective, and very clear evidence-based tactics. And in this case, the tactics don't come from behavior analytic research, they come from literacy research. And here's what the data would look like. So this is my reading, and then fill in the name of book A, right? Maybe it was dinosaurs. So this is my reading book A, and we're putting my there very specifically, and this is very congruent with the new use of the person-first language in the competency-based IEPs in British Columbia, where we like the I statements. You can use the my statement here, because this is the student's data. The student can look at this and go, oh, this is my reading data. And you see on that first read that they did 17 words in that minute, the timed minute, and they had 12 errors, which is way too high. Then in between the readings, the education assistant or the speech language pathologist or whoever the educator is employed the tactics, and then we read again and we took data, and we see the accurate words went up at the second reading in this one block of instruction. All this data comes from one sitting down at the table or in the library or wherever you happen to do the instruction. And the errors, because of your folding in tactic and you're targeting those specific sight words from the actual books, dropped to 6. And then we repeated some of those tactics, and we see an improvement in the data, and we did it again. And here's the final 1-minute trial of this instructional period. And now we've got 35 words per minute. We went from 17 to 35 words per minute. And the errors on that reading dropped down to 1. Right? So this is now meeting our objective. And you have this in-session data, which is this beautiful thing. It's really easy to collect and should be motivating to whoever is providing the instruction to go, look at my teaching power. This is exciting. And should be exciting for the student to say, look at my words going up. My line is going up. My mistakes are going down. And hopefully you have some reactivity to that data. Right? So we're going to get to the data, but just wanted to tie it into this example. Now, moving on. For strategies and tactics, sorry, tongue-tied after lunch. Again, the short-term objective provides the behavior, and we don't have an opportunity here to go through all the available strategies and tactics available to a special education program within an IEP, but you should be thinking about in the IEP, you're going to have the broad category. Here's the long-term goal. Here's the short-term objective or objectives under that umbrella, that one particular long-term goal. And then in most IEP templates, there's an adjoining column where you list the strategies. And the strategies should link up to these broad ideas, that you address the student's motivation, that you arrange the antecedent conditions, be specific in how you arrange those conditions, be specific in who does it and where and how often, that you will provide prompts, then the student will engage in the learning outcome, which is specified by the short-term objective, and then you will fade prompts across subsequent trials. And after the student responds correctly, you will deliver a consequence. That closes the learning loop. Right? You can kind of boil it down to provide instruction, provide prompts, provide reinforcement, make sure to fade those prompts. And over time, you want to make the reinforcement as natural as possible. That's kind of the punchline or the rule of thumb for strategies and tactics. Right? And you can certainly get more specific by going to some of those resources that I mentioned, by contacting the literacy research if it's around literacy objectives. And then do a lot of it, right? That is the strategies and tactics. I'm struggling with strategies. That's it for this section. It's fairly straightforward, and you want to keep it lean and mean and concise. And you don't want to be having those kind of error examples that I gave you, where there's just a wide list of things. And often when we look at those lists of strategies, people will ask, well, what does that mean? That's a red flag. Or are we still doing that? Or if there's multiple, reading programs or math programs as strategies, it usually needs to be narrowed down to one specific thing that we're doing, and we're going to do it well.